If you had to send a message 10,000 years into the future, how do you do it? By then, the language you speak and the country you live in will no longer exist, and everything about the world will be different. In this conversation, I speak with Ola Wikander, who's a senior lecturer at Lund University and an expert in ancient religions and extinct languages. We discuss the destruction of historic cities and cultures, deciphering of long-dead languages, and the role that religion has played in transmitting symbolism and imagery through time. We end with the question, how can we warn our descendants about where we've buried our nuclear waste? I'm Shane Farnsworth, and this is the Escape Sapiens podcast. If you enjoy what I'm doing, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this content. And now, here's Ola Wikander. I hope you enjoy.
Escape Sapiens.
So, when people talk about the problems with using nuclear power, one of the pretty much the main and only concern that people usually bring up is that, if we're going to be doing this, then in 10,000 years down the track, we will still have some radioactive material that we have to deal with. And so how do you store this material in a way that's safe for 10,000 years? Okay, so this is the main problem that people bring up. But there's sort of a related problem, and one that people don't think about as much, and that is in 10,000 years, the languages that we have today may no longer exist. The national boundaries may have evaporated. The culture will be completely different. And so even if we can somehow safely store the nuclear material, how do we let people know, far in the future that that's what we've done? And so that's ultimately what I want to get to today. But I want to start with your background, because you've come at this question from a completely, what people might see as an unusual direction. And so I want to start very basically, just a question about your background. What's exegesis and what's philology?
Well, two overlapping things there. Exegesis is, well, to put it simply, the scholarly field of exegesis, Old Testament and New Testament exegesis, for example, are the scholarly fields that study ancient texts, but ancient religious texts, specifically texts we know today as the Bible, using all available scholarly and scientific methods. It's a scholarly field that was developed to a large extent studying biblical texts, and it has to do with what is often referred to as historical critical study of biblical texts, which that's sometimes a misunderstood term. That doesn't mean critical in the sense of dislike. It means critical. Well, it can for some, obviously. But that's not what the point of the term. The point of the term is that you study the biblical texts with historical and linguistic methods, or any other scholarly or scientific method that might suit the text which you have before you. So that's basically what exegesis in academia means. It means the scholarly study of ancient religious texts, in particularly the Bible, even though the term can be applied to other texts as well. Philology is a broader term. Philology, well, that's basically the term for linguistic study of set texts, mostly ancient and at least pre-modern texts, not necessarily, but mostly. So it's linguistics as applied to textual study, as opposed to study of speech or phonetics or whatever. Philology is specifically the study of language as represented in corpora of often ancient texts, which means that exegesis in the scholarly sense often works in philology. In my case, it very much so.
So most of the researchers I know, so physicists, for example, the best thing that they could find is some new fundamental law. They're interested in, very fundamental questions about how the universe and how the world works. Whereas, from what I understand, your research is more like detective work in a certain sense. So what's the analog then? What's the bet? If you had your dreams come true and you discovered, what's the sort of thing that you would love to find out about the world in your research?
Well, nice. It could be a number of things. It could either be that they're a new textual find, including a new text that is fascinating in itself and gives context to text we know well, but completely new context, comparative context, for example. Another thing, you mentioned fundamental laws of physics. I mean, the analogy there, very much for someone who works, as I do, a lot in historical linguistics, is actually coming up with a sound law. That is a law that shows a regular linguistic development for a certain language. And people do this, and they're named, they're named out so-and-so's law, Geer's law, Philippi's law, etc., etc. And of course, that's if you get your name in a book with your law, with someone's law in it, I mean, it looks nice. I have no pretensions of doing that, but I mean, laws do appear in what I do as well.
So does that mean, so by a law, does that mean, so one thing I'm a bit curious about, before the talk, you told me that you can speak or something like 15 or 20 extinct languages.
Well, most of them are read, not spoken. But yeah, I've worked with many ancient languages.
That's the question that I had, which is that, so if you had some law, would that allow you to uncover what these languages sound like? Or you have no idea what they sound like at all?
I mean, well, that depends on the language. For some of the ancient languages of, say, the ancient Near East, which is what I've mostly been working on, we know quite well in certain cases what they would have sounded like. And the way we do know that is through linguistic and phonological reconstruction, which uses sound laws. Sound laws themselves are more like, they're almost mathematical, Sound X in an earlier language develops into sound Y in the later dialect, so they can almost be formulated as mathematical theorems, almost, But yes, I mean, a lot of what historical linguistics does, not the only thing, but a lot of what historical linguistics does has to do with looking at what languages sounded like, how they came to sound like that, but also, of course, why their morphological systems, that is, their verbal systems and inflectional systems, why that looks the way it does, why the vocabulary looks the way it does, which words are inherited, which words were borrowed from some outside source, and which words were created. I almost want to say from scratch, but that's not really a good term, because words are basically never created from scratch. They're created based on earlier material of some sort. Mm-hmm. There are very rare exceptions to this, but like words like quark and things, which was basically, I mean, that was taken from a James Joyce novel, so it was basically created from scratch. But mostly that doesn't happen. But historical linguistics studies how sounds change and develop, how words change and develop, how morphology, that is, inflections, change and develop. And this helps because it's not just an abstract exercise. Because I'm working in exegesis, for me, this is I apply this directly to the study of concrete text. Say a verb that was almost never used in classical Hebrew, but it is used in certain neighboring Semitic languages like Ugaritic, which is my specialty. If you look at how the relevant verb is used in that language, that can shed some light upon rare usages in Hebrew, etc., etc. So it has direct hermeneutical value as well. It's not just an abstract intellectual exercise. That said, the intellectual exercise part of it is quite nice, but that's not the end all and be all of it. Be all and end all of it.
It's it must be so hard to learn a language that's extinct. How do you do it? Because do you ever get the opportunity to practice with people, or is it just really working with the text? What do the conferences look like? Are you
there are, depending on, that all depends on what language we're talking about. Languages that have a sort of very solid tradition to this day, languages like Latin and Sanskrit, for example. I mean, you do have people speaking those languages just to do it, which I respect. But for languages like Ugaritic, Ugarit, the place where Ugaritic was spoken, was destroyed over 3,000 years ago. So there's no speaker base there. Nobody who's learned it as a traditional language either. Which means that what you have to work with is texts. And so what you usually do, the traditional method for learning this stuff is you read a certain set of texts, and you have a grammar, and you have hopefully a dictionary. That's not always the case, but hopefully you do have a dictionary, and then you work with text, and you work with them very, very, very minutely. That's another difference with how, I mean, when people learn modern languages, the way to do that is usually you learn very simple sort of set phraseology. My name is so and so. Can I have a beer? Where is the village? You know, all that sort of stuff. My sweater is green. You know, all that stuff. When you study ancient languages, that's not what you do. What you just take you start, of course, hopefully with some sort of reader or other, if there is one. Nowadays, there actually are readers for Ugaritic. There weren't for many years, but now there are. And you learn the basics of the grammar, and then you take the leap into, well, classical text, really. I mean, it's as I often tell my students I teach classical Hebrew, and I often tell my students that what you're going to do here is that in a couple of months or a half a year, you will be going from zero to studying the classical literature of this language. It's basically as though, if you had no English whatsoever, in a couple of months, you'll start reading Shakespeare. That's what it's like. That's what it's like. And this means that you study it slowly and laboriously and deliberately. You don't just read. Well, when you get further, you can start just reading. This happens over after a couple of years. You do start to get to really read, but the first thing you start to do is analyze. You read every single word and analyze every single verbal or noun form you can find to the minutest details and to the minutest level, and it has to be done like that. Unless you want to go for a direct method and just speak the language to the students, and for a language like Latin, that can be done and has actually been done quite successfully, teaching Latin through Latin. Most people don't do it that way, but some do, and it actually does work. But with Ugaritic, for example, that would be completely impossible, because there's the corpus of preserved material is, you can I don't have it with me right here in this room, but the entirety of Ugaritic in transliteration fits into a book this size. That's the whole of the Ugaritic language. What you see is what you get, which means that if someone, I remember many years ago, I was on a television interview in Sweden, and they asked me to say, and now the news, because the news were coming, and I was stumped. What am I going to say? And then, of course, I had some esprit d'escalier walking out of there. What the hadathati or something, but it's not. So I sort of hadathatu. I sort of constructed it in my mind, but it's not the normal vocabulary that you'll find in a language like that. But you will find very, very beautiful epic poetry about gods killing each other and battling it out, and so that's how you do it. Take a language. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, would these techniques work for, say, for example, you wanted to learn a living language. I don't know which ones you don't know, but perhaps if you wanted to learn Mandarin or Arabic or something, and you applied these techniques, how quickly do you think you could absorb a new language?
That's not a good way to learn a modern language. It really isn't, because the goal is so different. If there are, I don't want to point any fingers, but there are countries in which English is taught in that way. And people who study English like that, they've often read some pretty highbrow literature, but they can't speak if their life depended on it, because that's not what this sort of methodology is aimed at. It's not aimed at speech. It's aimed at very, very rapidly acquiring sort of inroad into a very, very complex set of textual matter. That's what it's aimed at, and that's what it provides. Like biblical Hebrew, yes, you can. When you've done that for a couple of years, you start being able to be relatively fluent in reading it. You really do. But it's not the way to learn modern Hebrew, for example. If you want a good cup of coffee in Tel Aviv, that's not, that's not the way to. But it's just that's just a matter of what the stated goal is, what the intentions of study are. Not to say that these two methods can't coexist, because I most certainly think they can. You can study, say, both a classical textually based version of a language and a spoken based version of a language at the same time. You can study both modern and classical Hebrew at the same time. It will be somewhat confusing, but it's possible to do. You can study both. Another good example is modern and classical Japanese, which are rather different languages, but which are mostly approached in these two ways. I mean, modern Japanese is mostly approached in the modern language pedagogy type of way, of course, whereas classical Japanese is very much studied in the classical way, that you analyze it step by step, etc., etc. And I think they both work quite well in tandem. I don't think there's really shouldn't be any opposition between them. It's just a matter of why and for what purpose and in what time frame. So I mean, I've seen people sometimes heatedly debating whether the old grammar translation method, which is the traditional way of learning classical languages, whether that should be sort of abolished because it's so different from how modern languages are. No, I think both work together. I really do. They serve somewhat different purposes, but they both teach good stuff. So yeah, what's not to like?
I guess the reason why I was curious is because I wanted to understand, so for an expert like yourself, what it's like actually, to what extent you can actually make use of extinct languages. So I guess the key question is, in what way does knowing these various, Ugaritic, for example, how does it bring alive the Bible, for example, in a way that is sort of lost if you're just reading it in English? What's the...
Oh yes, in innumerable ways, because especially mentioning Ugaritic. I mean, Ugaritic is, for the ones in the audience who may not know, Ugaritic is a language that was spoken in Syria, on the coast of Syria during the Bronze Age. And it's a close-ish relative of Hebrew. It's not an ancestor of Hebrew, but it's a close... I always liken it to the wizened old uncle of Hebrew. The analogy I like to use is that if Hebrew were one of the modern Scandinavian languages, like my own native language, Swedish, then Ugaritic would be Old Icelandic. So it's like the old saga, mythical language of the Northwest Semitic subfamily of languages. And if you have read and studied Ugaritic and the texts which are preserved in it, you get a very different perspective on Old Testament, right, Hebrew Bible text, because they show the mythological, that is the Ugaritic text, they show the mythological and poetic world out of which these biblical writings grew. They show a world of lightning hurling storm gods and chaos serpents whom these lightning hurling storm gods battle, which provides a wonderful sort of background for, say, texts from the Hebrew Bible, from Psalm 68, for example, which describes Yahweh as Rochev Ba'aravot, which is the exact equivalent of the term Rakibu Orpati in Ugaritic, the rider on the clouds, which is their quite nice title, by the way, the rider of the clouds, which is there applied to Baal. And you can see these almost verbatim, and in sometimes actually verbatim correspondences, which show that the writings of the Hebrew Bible, special though they are, I mean, that doesn't mean they're the same. That one must not make that mistake. But they grew out of a much bigger literary and linguistic universe, which the Ugaritic writings amply display. So yeah, it's as if you only have the biblical writings, and especially if you only have them in a modern language, you see like a tiny chink of a larger linguistic and literary world, and you see only this little bit of it. And if you add stuff to it, your understanding will hence be enlarged in innumerable ways. So yeah, it's a big difference. And just going to the Hebrew for the Hebrew Bible, for the Old Testament, is a huge difference. That's always one of the most exhilarating things for me as a teacher of Hebrew, to see my students who have, they're often biblically minded people who've read, they've read the Bibles, but to see them suddenly sort of notice the multi-layered expressions, the sometimes ambiguities of the original text or texts is exhilarating for me as a teacher. And that's very much why biblical exegesis exists as a subject.
Is there often when you're learning mathematics or something, or you watch students learning mathematics, you'll see like this click in their head, this aha moment. Is there some aha moment when you're reading the Old Testament, for example, as a research problem? Is there some key aha moment that sort of you notice in students in particular, or is it just the general feel of the entire exercise?
No. It's very specific, and one of the most specific things actually has to do not so much with the biblical text, but with the language as such. Biblical Hebrew, well, not just biblical Hebrew, basically all Semitic languages. But since we're talking about biblical Hebrew is a language with a large verbal system. There are lots and lots and lots of verbal forms. There are even more in Arabic, but classical Arabic. But biblical Hebrew has its fair share. And I mean, at first, many students can be sort of exasperated by this. They see these large tables of verbal forms that they're expected to learn by heart. They really are expected to learn them by heart. I semi-jokingly say that I want to be able to wake them up at 3 a.m. and they're supposed to go yiktol tiktol tiktol tiktoli yiktol yiktolu tiktol na tiktolu tiktol na niktol. I've actually never tried calling anybody up in the middle of the night. I think I would get in trouble if I did. But anyway, the real aha moment is when we suddenly get to the point where the students see this not just as a cluttered mess of verbal forms, but they suddenly see the system. When they take a step back and see this wonderfully mathematical-like system with root letters, Hebrew and Semitic words generally tend to be built on sort of skeletons of three root letters, three consonants, and then you sort of manipulate those in an almost mathematical way to produce the actual words. And when this system suddenly appears in all its glory, it's a wonderful thing to watch. It really is, and it happens every time. It happens every term, and it's again exhilarating.
Do you find that the majority of your students or the majority of people in the field are themselves religious? Or, I want to get a feel for... So there's two things I want to get a feel for. First off is, how it is that someone like yourself, for example, gets interested in ancient languages and long dead religions and the Near East and the Bronze Age collapse. And, so on the one hand, I want to get an idea of, how you get interested in this sort of thing, whether it's through a religious route and the other question I have, which is sort of related, I'll have to remind you if I've asked two difficult questions at the same time, but the second thing is I want to know, when you're looking at these things academically, if there's a danger of religious bias creeping in, or is this something that is difficult to deal with in the field, or how is that dealt with in the field? What does it look like?
Oh, yeah. Let's start with the first part of the question, because that's an easier thing to answer. Yes, I mean, many of my students are, in fact, studying for various positions in, say, ministry in, say, the Church of Sweden, because I work in Sweden, and that it is a fact that many people who are drawn to the study, especially of Hebrew, are drawn there either by either they have a Jewish background or they have a Christian background, and not just a Christian background, but one aimed at some form of work prospects, and that is a fact. And that's not the way I came into this. I had neither of those sort of inroads into the study of exegesis and classical Hebrew, but many do, and that is something that one has to deal with that with a certain Fingerspitzengefühl. You have to be there's a delicacy to this, that on the one hand, you have to keep, you have to have your cold historicist mind never shut down. But on the other hand, you can't just bash people over the head and saying, you have to be respectful. And at the same time keep to a sort of strict scholarly methodology, and this can be done. And I like to point out that the study of biblical exegesis is not at all the only field where this sort of problem comes up. I mean, imagine fields like certain forms of social science, economics, for crying out loud, economics. I mean, that's a normative science if I ever heard one, And there are others, and also other studies of religion. I mean, one example I often use is, take the study of ancient Norse religion, which may seem as a purely academic pursuit. You're interested in how religion was thought of and practiced in the ancient north of Europe. Cool, but that, just putting it like that, if you do that, you tend to forget the fact that there is today a number of not large but very active reconstructionist movements who practice modern Fornsíðir, modern Asatru, as it's sometimes called, modern reconstructionist Nordic religion. And the people who do that are extremely interested in scholarship because they often want to read up on what's the latest word on Odin or whatever, which means that people working on the Eddas or on ancient religion, archaeology of religion in the Nordic countries or whatever, they have an impact on believer communities as well. It's not just people working with the Bible. And that's something, that's very important to remember, that what scholars do often impacts modern people, whether we want to or not. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. I mean, it's just a matter of knowing that you're not just caught in a bubble. You should, in some cases, probably work as though you were while you're doing scholarship, because you have to be as unbiased as humanly possible. But as soon as you put those ideas in writing and publish them, that's just illustrated by the story of the Bible itself. I mean, as soon as it was put into writing, the texts were reread and reinterpreted and used for purposes which the authors never would have intended them to be. And the same, of course, goes for modern scholarship as well. But the thing I'd like to say is that, you have to separate, I think, what you believe as a scholar from, if you have, let's say you have a personal relationship with a text you're studying, you have to at least try to sort of say that, yes, as a scholar, I can argue this and this and that about the historical meaning of this text. And then as a believer, if one is such, I use this or interpret this as meaning such and such and such, and that these aren't it's different roles. It has to be different roles, and explaining that and making that stick is also one of the important parts of the exegetical training that we give, to show that there are different ways of reading, say, the Bible, biblical text, for different purposes, and the results you get out of using those different reading methodologies will be different and must be allowed to be different. That was a very long-winded answer. I don't know if it made any sense, but yeah.
No, it made a lot of sense. It was actually quite perfect.
Thank you. But
no, so I can understand. So the work is easy to motivate on the religious side, and then there's the academic side. And so one thing I want to know is you've also got to get grants and this sort of thing. So when you're selling the field as an academic field, which it is, my question is, for someone who's not religious, why is it important to know about these long dead religions and ancient languages? And what does it teach us about ourselves and our culture and the world that we live in? Like what's the at the end of the discussion, hopefully we'll get to nuclear semiotics and how to send messages into the future to 10,000 years, to let people know that maybe some some location has dangerous radioactivity. But, just today, here, now, what does this tell us about ourselves?
Well, there are many different answers to that question, which will depend a bit on the audience, of course. But to sell the field, as you so succinctly put it, I mean, it's studying ancient languages and ancient texts, and specifically, say, the biblical text, but not exclusively, grants us a window into the thought of ancient people. And a window into the thought of ancient people, well, it's thought that is, it's alive in the sense that, say, if we do take the biblical writings, there are a number of major religions. One of them including the number one religion in terms of people in the world, i.e. Christianity, that regard these texts as normative in some way or other. I mean, exactly what that means differs, but, some sort of normativity, which means that studying these texts and what they are and why they look the way they do and how they've been used and when they were written and how their meanings have been reinterpreted over time becomes very important, because it shows, it studies basically a big part of the history, the intellectual history of humankind. And if we widen the scope beyond these texts to just ancient texts generally, well, the human species has had the enormous privilege to be able to write down its ideas and poetry and stories and quote unquote science for about 5,000 years, a little more than 5,000 years. It's not more than that. In the grand scheme of things, 5,000 years is very little. But during that time, we've had this enormous privilege, and this means that there is this huge amount of textual material giving us a direct view into the way that ancient people thought and lived and argued and loved and hated and made war and made peace, and their ideas about gods and their ideas about love and their ideas about the future and their ideas about who they were and what it means to be a human being. And I always love to say that this whole show starts becoming me quoting myself. It's a little embarrassing, but anyway, I always love to say that the world did not start in 1945. I mean, because that's it, or 1991 for that matter, given recent developments in the world, that we have access to these huge swaths of human development. And I don't mean development in the evolutionary sense, just development in the sense of changing history. We have this access through the texts, and not using that, that means deliberately cutting ourselves off from our own intellectual history, which is selling ourselves short a bit, don't you think?
I want to come back at the end and ask you about perspectives on how, what this tells us individually and what our lives mean and what the limited time we have on this earth looks like in these sort of larger perspectives. But I want to skip away from that for the moment to look back at the languages again, because I'm curious what it means to decipher an ancient language. I mean, in practice, so I'm imagining originally we didn't know anything about Ugarit, for example, and we found some texts, and then someone had to decipher it. So, what are the principles of translation from that early stage? What does it look like, and what does it mean once you say the text is deciphered?
Oh, well, deciphering is one thing, translating is another. Deciphering here would refer to when Ugarit was discovered in 1928, and then it was excavated for many years, and texts in many languages were discovered at the site because it was a multilingual society. But focusing on Ugaritic itself, which was the native language of the city, written on clay tablets, but not with the international cuneiform, cumbersome cuneiform script, but in a local version of cuneiform, which was alphabetic. So they had an alphabet, which is a very, very sort of interesting mix. They used the idea of the alphabet crossed with the idea of writing cuneiform on tablets. So they took these two writing principles and crossed them, which is fortuitous because that means that their writings have been preserved very well, because cuneiform clay tablets are very easily preserved archaeologically. But anyway, when this language was entirely unknown, I mean, the first thing that had to be done, and this one was quite quick, actually. Three different scholars basically working not together, but at the same time, basically cracked this just during the course of a few years. And the way they did that was, first they noted that this new script, the Ugaritic script, had around 30 letters. And that in itself told them that this might be a Semitic language, because there are other Semitic languages spoken in the area with about that amount of letters, Hebrew being one. Hebrew has a bit fewer, but it's in the same wheelhouse. And given the location in time and place, a Semitic language was a good bet. Semitic is the language family that includes Hebrew and Arabic and Amharic and Akkadian and Aramaic and so on. And then what they did was they noticed so they guessed that this might be an alphabet as opposed to a syllabary, and they were right. It is a consonantal alphabet. And one thing, for example, they noted that many texts began with a certain letter that had 3 downwards wedges, and then they guessed, well, maybe these are letters, and maybe that's the letter l, because in many northwest Semitic languages, le or la tends to mean two, as in two so and so, and that turned out to be correct. So then they had one letter down, and then you go on from that. So, the great advantage in deciphering Ugaritic is that it's rather closely related to Hebrew and Aramaic, and a bit further away, Arabic and Akkadian, even further away. But they had something to build on. They could use what was known about Semitic languages in the area to sort of reconstruct what a language at that point might have looked like, and then it was just a matter of, finding which letter was which, basically. So that was a relatively easy one, because there were the comparanda both in terms of language and in terms of format, say letter into correspondence, was so abundant. It's much more difficult if you have an unknown script in a language where you have no idea what the linguistic family would be, for example. And there are such examples. I mean, it's like one of the most famous examples is Linear A, which is the script that preceded the famous Linear B from Crete, which was the earliest writing for Greek. There's an earlier version called Linear A, which still to this day is an unsolved riddle. There are all sorts of suggestions that it's a form of Semitic, or it's a form of Luvian, or it's this or it's that, but we just don't know. Because there's not a certain way to just say that this is probably a so and so type language. We just have, the signs to go on, and it's. I very much doubt that Linear A will ever be solved conclusively. I don't know.
Is that because there's not? I imagine that if you had enough text, that you could look at, the frequency of words and use tricks like this. Is there? I guess I have two questions. Is there not enough text? Like, how much text do you need? And another example, of course, is the Rosetta Stone. So there you had, you've got these three different languages, but obviously you don't have every word in the language written down. So how do you sort of bootstrap your way up from the 2,000 words that are on the tablet to, a full? That seems like
a full knowledge of the language.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a piece by piece type proposition. If you do have a good bilingual or a set of good bilinguals, I mean, the Rosetta Stone is a good example of that, where you have the same text in 2 languages and 3 scripts, so you can sort of you can compare them. And then when you have a good-ish set of words down pat in a script or a language, you can find those in other texts, and then you can use various contextual clues. Given the genre of the text, this word should be meaning that, and then you test that on another text to see if that meaning fits there. And if it turns out the language does have known relatives, then you can use data from that. That's what's been done for Ugaritic, for example. You could, once it was totally totally crystal clear that yes, this is a Northwest Semitic language. You could start using etymologies from Hebrew, for example, to elucidate. That wasn't as easy for Egyptian, but it's very much a matter of, take for each and every word or root you actually get to know. You check all your other texts. Does this word seem to appear in any other text? If it does the proposed meaning fit there? And that may help you to guess what the next word means. And that and when that snowball starts rolling, it gets better and better. The problem, of course, is that for some languages we have very little text, or very stereotypical text. One favorite example of mine there is Etruscan. There are lots of texts in Etruscan that we have preserved, lots and lots. It's like 9,000 or 10,000 texts, inscriptions, but most of those are very, very, very short, and most of them are funerary, like so and so lies here. He or she lived for so and so long and served as this and that in this and that city. In many cases, not even that. In many cases, it's just a name, and that means that we have a very, very good knowledge of funerary terminology in Etruscan. We know terms for sarcophagi and funeral chambers and death and living for so and so many years, but other pieces of the vocabulary are much, much less known, and that becomes a problem when one does find longer texts that are on completely different things, and then we're not really helped by the fact that we know what the word for sarcophagus is, because that's not what the text speaks about. And that actually ties in with the nuclear semiotic thing, because one of the problems that I've been sort of trying to hold up to the light is the fact that underscore is the fact that we may in the far future, end up in a situation where, yes, people can read English, a certain subset of English. They may be able to read a specific type of English vocabulary, let's say funerary texts or texts describing, I don't know, household items or whatever the case may be. But they may be, as in the Etruscan case, they may know that vocabulary super well, but have big problems reading about nuclear power, for example.
So when can you sort of watch the evolutionary march of language as time goes on? And sort of a related question, do you think, for example, so now Chinese scripts, so when people write out in Mandarin, for example, they use characters. Do you think in the near future, in the future, we're going to see something more analogous to what an alphabetic script where you sort of sound out the...
Oh, not really. And I would like to object to the word evolutionary, because this is, I didn't
mean to put any value judgment.
No. It is a fact that alphabets have mostly appeared in this way, that you first have some sort of pictographic script and then like in early cuneiform, for example, where you literally drew a picture of a head and then read that as the word head, and then you start extrapolating the sound from that, and you start reading the entire syllable for the word head. And then in certain cases, like in the precursors of the alphabet, which probably was created on the model of Egyptian hieroglyphics, where they started to use just the simple consonant that it, acrophonically, that the first consonant of the word was used. Like they really, really early versions of the alphabets, you could do things like you can draw a picture of a house or a tent and use that for b, because bait means bait, or beit means house, and whether or not, I don't think that's going to happen for Chinese. Not at all, because that's why I don't really like the word evolutionary, because that implies some sort of teleology, that it's moving in a certain direction, and I don't think it is. It's take Japan, for example. Already in the Middle Ages, they started adding to the characters that they borrowed from the Chinese. They added their own syllabaries, which are now today known as hiragana and katakana, which spell every syllable of the language. And it would be perfectly possible for every Japanese text to be written only in these easy-to-use syllabaries. But they don't. They keep the kanji. They keep the Chinese characters, because They think it's eminently practical. And it is when you know it. It's hard as nails when you're trying to learn it, but when you know it, it's eminently practical. And so, no, I honestly can't really see that. I know that there were ideas in China of using, at one point, an alphabetic script. I mean, that was in days of Mao Zedong. They had ideas that might one day be a direction in which they wanted to move, but nothing really ever came of it. And I don't think it will, because it's because of cultural heritage. I mean, if you stop learning all these characters, they would effectively be shutting themselves off from their own cultural history.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't really see that happening. And the same goes for Japan. I can't really see that happening. And it's not a thing that's really being debated, actually. It's like but it does mean that in Japan it takes like 12 years of schooling to learn to read and write well. I mean, it takes a long time. And this is for people who speak Japanese as their first language. It's much harder when you have to learn the language as well. Ask me, I know. I mean, I practice my kanji all the time, and it's a tall order. It really is.
It sounds like I'm being flippant, but I'm really not. So, with this next point, which is that, these days we use emojis. So we have these symbols that are being added back into the English language, for instance. I don't know whether this is a counterexample to the idea that there's sort of this monodirectional flow of...
Well, no, I wouldn't really count those either way, because emojis, interestingly enough, a Japanese word, by the way, they're not writing. They're not really writing. They're sort of paralinguistic signals. They signal feelings, or they signal like associative patterns. This makes me think of a camel bearing a heavy load, or whatever. But they're not really linguistic. They don't actually signal a spoken word, for example. If anything, they're more akin to in cuneiform and in Egyptian hieroglyphics, by the way, there's a thing called determinatives, which is a sign you put next to a word in order to show what sort of category of word that is. Like in cuneiform, if you're writing about something that is stereotypically made of wood, you often put a niche sign in front of it. A niche is the Sumerian word for wood. But it's not really an emoji either. So no, I don't think that's really a super good analogy, to be honest. I mean, we do have some ideograms in modern writing, like the ampersand, the and sign. That's a good example of an idea, and the numeral figures, like the figure 8, for example. If you use that in writing, it's basically an ideogram. You don't write out the word 8; you write an 8.
Yeah, okay. I'd not really thought of that before. But that is actually a pretty good example.
Yeah. You can argue that a language like English, which has a very complex relationship, to put it mildly, between writing and speech, because English spelling in many ways harkens back to the language the way it was like 1,000 years ago. It's an extremely conservative way of spelling, which means that some words almost are ideographic. I mean, the whole cough though problem. It's a OUJH, but it sounds completely different in cough and though, and and tough. And there are many examples of that. That English has frozen so many spellings that they almost become ideographic. You have to know the word in order to know what the spelling means. But in many other cases, you can guess, on the other hand.
So if we jump back into... I don't want to get too far away from Ugarit, because I have some questions there. I'm just sort of curious. So Ugarit was a city that was right beside where modern Israel is, so now in Syria.
Well, not right beside, a bit to the north. A bit to the north.
A bit to the... I guess in
the same cultural sphere, yeah.
So the thing I'm sort of curious about is what sort of in what way do they mention each other? So I know that in the Bible they talk about Baal, who's this god in the Ugarit. Do they do the same in the other direction? So in the Ugaritic text they talk about Yahweh and
no, interestingly they don't. That's very there has been a suggestion of one single place in the Ugaritic literature that would mention Yahweh, but it's probably not. I don't believe. Well, some would disagree with me, but I don't really buy that. So no. Interestingly enough, so many of the divine names are similar. Like one of the most common biblical Hebrew words for God is the word El, which basically means God, but it's also a name of the ancient Canaanite god El, who was the big papa on the throne, like the stereotypical old man god, with a beard and everything. That's El, and he is all around at Ugarit. He's the big old Semiotics father who sits on his throne and goes like, "Yeah, you young'uns can keep this going," and the young'uns have to vie for supremacy, and one of these young'uns is Baal. Whereas El is more like, yeah, I'll just sit here and basically literally twiddle my thumbs. It literally says that. He twirls his thumbs like this, and takes it easy, basically. And El occurs at both Ugarit and in the Hebrew Bible. So, and Baal occurs in Ugarit and the Hebrew Bible. And numerous other characters do, but not Yahweh. Isn't that interesting? And then, of course, the Hebrew Bible goes all the way after a while and starts saying that El and Yahweh are the same character. Originally, they weren't, but they start identifying them. And that's really interesting, because what the various authors of the Hebrew Bible do with the other gods, some of them they sort of assimilate, like El. They basically, they come right out and say that El and Yahweh are the same. The most classical example is Genesis chapter 14, in which Abraham meets a priest of El, and he says, basically, "Your God is my God. I swear by Yahweh, who is El, the creator of heaven and earth." So it's this very, very deliberate they lets the character of Abraham identify them very deliberately, which is a pretty cool thing. But on the other hand, Baal, which in many ways was a more similar god to Yahweh than El was, it's like, nope, no Baal here, absolutely not. Oh, no, Baal is evil. Oh, he's so evil. So they went two completely different directions there. With El, they said, yeah, El, Yahweh, same. But with Baal, it's like, nope, bad. Which, of course, shows some sort of social reality in which Baal and Yahweh competed for the same roles among certain people, where you can see this very clearly in the book of Hosea, the prophetic book of Hosea, which early in the book does a pun where Yahweh says to the people, "Do not call me my Baal, but my Ish." And that's a pun in Hebrew, because Baal in Hebrew, it can mean the god Baal, it can mean master or lord, but it can also mean husband. And Ish is the word meaning man. So don't call me my husband, call me my man. And that means don't invoke me using the name Baal.
Yeah.
It's a pun on the triple meanings of the word Baal. Don't call me your Baal, call me your man. Don't call me your husband, call me your man. And that seems to show that, at least in some periods, there was a sort of, some people wanted to invoke Baal, and the prophet says, no, don't do that. That's not good. But with El, it's okay. And that's really interesting, isn't it?
See, this is what I'm a bit curious about. When we think of Judaism, we usually think of it as being a monotheistic religion. But
yeah.
So the thing that I'm curious about is, how did people 3,000 years ago or even further back, how did they view gods from neighboring religions? Did they view them as real gods that we just don't worship, or are they competing gods? Are they just fake things that crazy group have come up with? What was the idea?
Well, it depends on when. When Judaism was sort of codified as the classical rabbinic standard Judaism that was codified after the fall of the Second Temple, which is in the early centuries as a common era, it became very much a monotheist religion. There is only one God, at least officially. But if you look in the texts of the Hebrew Bible, which are in many cases much, much, much older than that, you can see that the prevailing attitude seems to be something like this, that yes, there are various divine beings, and we're only supposed to worship our God, which is Yahweh, whom we identify with El, so we get him as part of the package, but Baal is out, Baal is bad. But there are texts in the Hebrew Bible that very clearly show that the authors regard other divine beings as real. There's one, for example, which says that has an Israelite character talk to worshippers of Chemosh, who was the god of, for example, the Moabites and certain other people, saying things like, well, when you're in trouble, Chemosh protects you. In the same way, Yahweh protects us. So the problem there doesn't seem to be how many gods are there. That doesn't seem to be a problem that even comes up. The question is, which God is powerful and which God takes care of us? That seems to be the problem. The problem does not seem to be how many gods are there. That doesn't seem to be a question that was really raised to the question is, which is the important God? Which is the God to whom we should direct our prayers and supplications and offerings? That is the problem. It's a very practical problem. This problem of how many divine beings exist doesn't seem to be as much on the mind of the authors of the Hebrew Bible as it may be on the minds of many today. And that's an interesting question. There's a very eminent Ugaritologist and scholar of the Hebrew Bible called Mark Smith. And he writes somewhere, I'm quoting from memory now, he writes something like that the Hebrew Bible was read for monotheism. That is, it was read as though it was monotheist, even though that's perhaps not really a good description of what these early texts always are. They often preach monolatry. That is, you should only worship this God. But that's not the same as monotheism. One of my favorite texts from the Hebrew Bible is Psalm 29, which is very Ugaritic-like. It has the big, the big lightning-throwing storm god. Yahweh is presented, he throws his lightning bolts and the cedars crack, and his voice is thundering over the waters. It's very, very high fantasy-ish. I love it. It's one wonderful text. And what you find there is these other characters called B'nai Elohim, which means God's sons, and being a ben of something, son of this or this or that, in classical Hebrew is a way of saying a representative of this or that category. So it means something like divine beings, and these divine beings are exhorted to praise Yahweh. So these other, whatever they are, mini gods or something like that, are exhorted to praise Yahweh. And then the question becomes, how many gods are there? Well, that depends on what you mean by God. The author of that text would probably say there's one supreme God, and then there's these other guys, these B'nai Elohim, who are sort of there. And the classical image of that seems in the Hebrew Bible, in the times when these texts were written, seems to be something like this, that there was a bureaucracy. There was the king. The main metaphor for Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible is not father, it's king. He's a king. And what does a king do? He sits on his throne, in his throne room, and around him is his entourage of ministers and functionaries and petty clerks and whatever. And these are these smaller gods who are like his retinue even. But he's the boss. He's the boss. But that doesn't mean the other guys don't exist. They're there. Perhaps they aren't as powerful. Perhaps they aren't as important. But they're not non-existent. And it's very nice to sort of nice to see how then later texts that did grow more monotheist tended to reinterpret these smaller guys as angels. If you look in the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. In many cases, where it says B'nai Elohim, that is divine beings in the Hebrew text, they translate it as angeloi, angels. Conundrum solved, at least temporarily. And there are many examples of this. I mean, it all comes down to what you mean by God.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by God? Do you mean any supernatural being? Do you only mean the highest supernatural being? How many highest beings can there be? Just one?
So the other gods were somehow like absorbed, and I guess there's the devil as well that we talk about in Christianity.
I mean, the devil is a later development. In the Hebrew Bible, the devil is very scarce indeed. You do find Hasatan in some Hebrew books of the Hebrew Bible, but he's very rare on the ground, so to speak. He appears for example, in the prologue of the book of Job, and interestingly enough, there he doesn't appear to be evil. He's just like some sort of court functionary, the opposer, the accuser, and he makes a bet with Yahweh. You know that I've been walking around on the earth, taking a look around, and I found this guy called Job, and he's a super pious guy, and I want to check, is he really that pious? I want to make a bet with you. Can I crack this? Can I crack him? And Yahweh says, okay, you're on. You're on. And they make this sort of bet, and Yahweh gives the Satan, the Hasatan, he gives him a free rein to subject this poor Job guy to all sorts of stuff, and Job more or less cracks, and finally says, no, this world is in the hands of a criminal, a rasha. He openly accuses Yahweh of being a criminal because all these bad things are happening to him. And then finally in chapters 38 and following, Yahweh appears in a storm wind. Of course, in a storm wind, where else? And gives him a piece of his mind and basically says that if I weren't here, it would be infinitely worse. It's also fun. His argument isn't, I am the absolute being. No, his argument is, if I weren't here, the world would be even more chaotic and poor. So the Satan does exist, but he's not Satan in the Christian sense. He's more like a court functionary. Again, it's this court scene type thing going on.
So how did people then, if you go back to, 3,000 years when sort of Ugarit was destroyed, how did people view the evil, the problem of evil, let's say? I guess it was easier in religion where you have a full pantheon, because you can say good things are due to this part of the pantheon, and this and there's evil, it sits over here. But when you push in the monotheistic direction, it's harder, right? Unless you have like a devil figure or
I mean, that's a very, very complex question, because I mean, of course, people did think about this quite a lot, and there are texts from Mesopotamia, for example, who are in a way quite similar to Job, taking up this sort of, why does my God abandon me? Why am I abandoned to all this evil in my life? This is a sort of recurring thing. At Ugarit, what they did very much was they had, certain gods that were powers of chaos, and specifically there were two. There was Mort, who was the god of death, who has a big, big, big mouth and eats everything. That's a very illustrative image, and the summer drought is due to his power because he kills everything. And there's Yam, who Yam means sea, and the big chaotic sea that you can drown in. So those are sort of the chaotic powers that Baal has to literally fight them to pacify them. And this appears in the Hebrew Bible as well. You can find numerous texts in which Yahweh has to fight either the sea or a big sea dragon and pacify it. This recurs a number of times. Psalm 89 has it, Psalm 74 has it, Job has it. That this idea that there was a big sea monster whom Yahweh had to literally crush his heads on the waters, as one of the Psalms puts it, in order to make the world livable. That otherwise the world would just be filled with big, dangerous sea dragons that would eat us up. So this was very much a living conception to the writers of the Hebrew Bible, that the world is a very chaotic place. And what God does, what Yahweh does, is make it livable. And that's basically what he says in the book of Job. Could you pull up the Leviathan with a fish hook? And the intended answer, of course, is no human being could do that. We need a god so that the Leviathan doesn't come to eat us up. And it's not the devil in the moralistic sense that Christianity that later made it into, but it's the sense of great chaos and evil being present as a natural part of the world. And we need a warden. We need someone who can go out and be our champion. And that someone in the Hebrew Bible is Yahweh. And it's really interesting. You can see a sort of development. If you look at Psalm 104, this is developed, and there Leviathan is just a plaything. The Leviathan is this big dragon. It says, Leviathan, whom you created to play with, as though he was some sort of rubber duck. And then even later in the Talmud, it says that God spends like a couple of hours or an hour every day playing with a Leviathan, as though he were a rubber duck. So you can see this sort of devaluing of this power. In the earliest text, he's a literal monster whom God, that is Yahweh, has to battle it out with. And then he becomes a creation of Yahweh, whom Yahweh has created to play with. And in the end, he becomes almost pathetic. But yeah, this idea that chaos is a constant threat, that's something that's very, very real to the authors of the Hebrew Bible. There's a professor at Lund University, now retired, Fredrik Lindström, who wrote about a book called Suffering and Sin, on how this is reflected in the complaint psalms of the Hebrew Bible. That is the psalms in which an individual complains about suffering. And what he found there is that these psalms, what they do is they don't say, God, you have subjected us to this terrible suffering. What they say is, oh God, you're gone. God has left the building. Yahweh done left the building. And we're left with these chaos powers. Death is eating me up. And unless Yahweh comes back, we're without any, we don't have any recourse. So there seems to have been this great fear of Yahweh walking out on us. We have to get him back.
It's a very different picture to sort of the Genesis God that created the world, right? It seems like the world's there's chaos, and he's the custodian of something like this. But if you go back to early Judaism, how did people see these magical stories? Like, did people really believe that Noah had his ark and God flooded the world? And did people really... how was it real to them, or was it a cultural thing, or what was it?
I mean, believe is an anachronistic word. There's an old saying that if you'd asked an Athenian in, say, the 5th century BCE, do you believe in Athena? They wouldn't even have understood the question. It's like, do you believe in the sun? It's a pointless question. Belief as a construct is very much a function of Lutheranism, or at least Protestantism, this idea that belief is the central part of religion. For lots of religious history, and in many parts of the world still, belief is not the be-all and end-all of religion. But that said, yes, I would say that many people believe this to be true, and I mean, today many do. You can see this, like there are, from Babylonia, there are Jewish Babylonia, there are lots of a great corpus of incantation bowls. It's like bowls with spells written on the inside, often curses on, may this or that person not hurt me with his or her evil stratagems. And they say things that, may the spell that bound the Leviathan come down upon him. And I mean, that shows that this idea of the great serpent Leviathan was very much alive. It wasn't just a literary thing, it's a dangerous big serpent, that God had pacified. And maybe we can use that same power against our evil neighbor who tries to steal our stuff, or whatever the case may be. So yeah, this is.
Oh, sorry. Sorry for interrupting you there at the end. The one sort of interesting question I have is that so you mentioned that Jewish people saw Baal as sort of this evil god that you're not interested in, but I know that you look at poetic motifs that go from the Ugarit texts, and that you can sort of find also in the Bible. And the question, I sort of have two questions.
sort of a psychology one, which is, if Jewish people really saw these texts as being evil and sort of, these are rival gods that we're not interested in, why would they adopt texts from these people? And
no.
And this, I guess the second question is, the second question is sort of a little bit related, which is, how do you know that these texts are the same? Like, what are the cues? Like, how is it that they use words that are not commonly used, or like how do you make the links?
Two things there. The first thing is, in the periods in which the Hebrew Bible, the earlier texts of the Hebrew Bible were written, they're not Jewish in the sense that we use the term Israelite would be better. In the later text, Jewish does work, because then that's in the period of Second Temple Judaism. But for the earliest texts, I would say Israelite, because we're at that period of time. But anyway, why they would use, say, epithets that were earlier connected with Baal, for example? Well, one, this is probably not a matter of them using Ugaritic texts. Ugarit was destroyed shortly after 1200 BCE, perhaps around 1180 or 1170, by the so-called Sea Peoples, which is another difficult quantity, but that's another question. And that means that it's very, very unlikely that any authors represented in the Hebrew Bible ever read a Ugaritic text. I mean, I'm not going to say impossible, but extremely unlikely. There's no reason at all to presuppose that ever happened. They never read the Baal cycle, which is the major mythological text from Ugarit about the god Baal. What they would have had, though, is what I like to refer to as a bardic consciousness. That is, they would have phraseology that sort of was floating around among the quote unquote campfires of the day. It doesn't have to have been campfires, but you get my point. Literary tropes and motifs in which stories were told, and those would not necessarily have been stamped Baal. Some might have been, but not necessarily. And at the point where Baal became thought of as such an evil guy, these connections might have been entirely forgotten. So I don't think that would have even been that problem wouldn't even have registered, because people wouldn't have thought, the rider of the clouds is Baal. They wouldn't have thought that. They would have thought the rider of the clouds is Yahweh. It's just that the terminology is the same that was used to describe Baal at Ugarit, but they wouldn't have thought that's Baal at Ugarit. They'd have thought that's our storm god. And who's our storm god? Well, it's good old Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh, good old Yahweh himself. So that would probably not have been a problem. The problem would perhaps have been in the cases where worshippers of Baal would have said, no, our god is the real rider of the clouds. Then there might have been a sort of some bit of electrical friction going on, But then the problem would have been who's the real rider of the clouds, not which terms are appropriate to use. That's one thing. The second thing is, how does one recognize common motifs and patterns? And as you so rightly say, my scholarship is very much, not exclusively, but to a very large extent, focused on inherited poetic motifs that are found in common at Ugarit and in the Hebrew Bible. And I do say inherited now in the linguistic sense. I have to make that caveat that inherited means here not by blood. There's no sort of genetic mysticism going on, nothing like that. It's a matter of inheriting in the sense of as you inherit a language, and languages change using sound laws, etc. The way you discover those is when you see very similar phraseology, very similar mythological patterns, ideally using similar etymological material, that is similar words. And it's even better in cases, as you mentioned, where these words are used very, very rarely in the target language, so to speak. The best example is the one having to do with the battle against the Leviathan. There you can find some extremely specific terminology that's basically only used there in the Hebrew Bible. It's like occurring twice in the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, and all the specific terminology for the Leviathan being writhing and fleeting, which occurs exactly verbatim at Ugarit, describing that very thing. And there you have, it's like, that's a clincher right there. In many cases, it's not. I mean, that's one of the nicest cases where it's a specific, exact, verbatim formula that sort of can't. It's impossible that it would have appeared by chance. It must have been a sort of mutual poetic inheritance. In some cases, it's not as clear. Some cases, it's more nebulous. You find one word that's been used in a similar context, but put in a different, larger context. Well, actually, the Leviathan thing is like that. The words are the same, but the context is totally different. In the Baal cycle, when they use this terminology of the Leviathan, or Litanu, as it's called in Ugaritic, the writhing serpent, the fleeting serpent, this exact terminology, it's the god of death accusing Baal of having done this. You've slayed this demon, this terrible serpent. In the Hebrew Bible, where this occurs, in Isaiah 27 verse 1, it's an eschatological prophecy about what Yahweh will do at the end of days. Then he will crush the Leviathan, the writhing serpent, the fleeing serpent. So the context of it is completely different, and that ties that back to what I said earlier, that something is similar and has shared inheritance doesn't mean it's the same. I mean, that's the problem. On the internet, there are all of these sorts of skeptic websites where they go through, the Bible is a hoax because this is the same as that and this is the same as that, so all the Bible is just a hoax. Well, no, that doesn't follow at all. One, the examples they use are often erroneous. That's the first problem. The second one is, well, no, the only thing that means is that literature doesn't appear out of a vacuum. No literature does ever. How could it? I mean, every piece of literature that's written harkens back to something that the author or authors knew.
But I guess maybe the point they're making there is that the book is supposed to be infallible, and it's maybe the very point they're trying to make is that it's not coming from human. That it shouldn't be coming from humans if it's.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm seeing what you're saying, but again. I don't want to make a theological statement on infallibility here. I certainly don't. But anyway, even that wouldn't. I mean, let's say a person who does believe in the infallibility of the Bible. I don't, but say a person who does could just answer, well, God chose cultural artifacts to make his point. Why wouldn't he? I mean, it's a complete non sequitur to say that just because something is part of a bigger cultural whole, therefore it is devoid of value. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense, and making that argument is predicated on arguing against a very, very specific literalist, fundamentalist view of mainly Protestant Christianity, which isn't even representative of Protestant Christianity generally. So it's sort of a straw man, and I want to make that absolutely clear that the stuff I'm doing, yes, it does show that the Hebrew Bible is not as unique as you thought it was, but maybe it was. I mean, it wasn't unique for the reason some people think, that it's absolutely not similar to anything else. Oh, yes, it is. But it is unique in the sense that it uses these inherited poetic techniques and what have you to make very specific points that the Ugaritians did not and could not have made. I mean, like the history of the Israelite people with the exile in Babylon. The Ugaritians were never in exile in Babylon. They didn't have that trauma. But the writers of the Hebrew Bible most certainly did. And it shines through, perhaps not on every page, but in very, very many pages, this national trauma of the exile in Babylon, where Israelite statehood, or Judahite statehood, I should say, was destroyed, and they had to live under the rule of the Babylonians. That trauma is very specific to the Hebrew Bible and is very unique, in fact. So similar and unique are not mutually exclusive, to be brutally honest.
So this idea of national trauma is something I want to sort of latch onto here, because in the Old Testament, there's like prophecy about the end of days and all this sort of thing.
Yeah.
But Judaism is still around, or sort of the descendants of the Israelites are still around, whereas Ugarit was destroyed. And so I'm trying to lead into what it looks like in text to watch a civilization crumble. But before that, I just wanted to just because people won't be familiar with Ugarit at all, and so what actually happened? Who are the sea people, and what happened to Ugarit?
Well, that's a sticky wicket, to put it mildly. Around or shortly after 1200 BCE, there was a series of cataclysmic upheavals all around the ancient the Eastern Mediterranean, and there seem to have been a number of different reasons for this. One was climate, some sort of climactic change. There were a number of bad droughts. Interestingly enough, bad droughts, given that one of the main dangers described in the Baal cycle is drought, which is caused by the god of death, who swallows Baal whole, so Baal cannot send his rain. So then all the land just crumbles and dies because of this massive drought. The sun is burning and everything. So there was massive drought in the Eastern Mediterranean. And also, there were attacks by these people known as the Sea Peoples, who are some of the greatest sort of known unknowns of ancient history. They were apparently conglomerates of different peoples, sea-born peoples, who attacked various civilizations across the coast. They attacked Egyptians up in the Nile Delta. That's where they have the biggest description of them, because Ramesses III battled them, and he enumerates numerous of the term sea people comes from Ramesses III's description of his battles against these guys who came and raided. But they attacked many different cultures, and their attacks seem to have been ongoing for quite some time, and and in combination with the problems in agriculture, with the climate, and a downturn of the economic sort of distributions, seems to have led to a general downturn in all these major cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean around or before 1200, and a little after BCE, and that led to the destruction of the Hittite Empire. That led to the destruction and abandonment of Ugarit. There seems to have been some sort of mass exodus from Ugarit, and it led to a downturn, at least, in Egypt. And the problem is that these sea peoples, again, we have lists of peoples that were part of them, but we have nothing of their own words. One of the sea peoples was probably the guys who later ended up as the Philistines, Philistines. Who lived on the coast of what is today Israel, and are enemies, sometimes allies of the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible, but mostly enemies. And they were probably one of these sea peoples who settled on the coast of Palestine after having raided for a bit. So they were probably one of them. They appear in this list. But though they're only one of the guys who appear and some of them probably ended up in Sicily, and there are others, and so they were apparently the great military menace of the age, and or at least they contributed to this mass cultural collapse around the Eastern Mediterranean at that time, and it wasn't nice to be alive.
Why is it that so they were attacking Egypt and they destroyed Ugarit, presumably, whereas the Israelites are sort of in between those two. Why were they untouched?
I mean, we don't know that they were, but the Israelites by then the Israelites were an unknown quantity. There was no Israelite state at that point, and so they would not have been one of the major targets, because there was no Israelite statehood at that point at all. So, or if it was, I mean, it wasn't a statehood. It was possibly some sort of vague tribal federation, but that's extremely debated, and I don't want to make a firm statement. But it wasn't anyway. It wasn't a state. There actually is a letter, a couple of letters, but especially one from the last days of Ugarit, from the ruler there, writing and sort of begging for help, that they're attacking, and my troops are dispersed. Some of them are up north, and some of them are off, and we can't defend ourselves. Send help! Send help! So we get a direct view of the great feeling of dread that they could see that things were going south.
So they knew. So they knew this was happening, and because this is directly what I'm interested in. What does the collapse of a civilization look like in text?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like help, send ships. That's what it looks like. Help, come help, send us troops, send ships. That's what it looks like, and it's palpable. The sense of dread, and it's a bit, it's not a fun experience reading it, that you can feel the dread that even the upper classes of Ugarit felt, that they knew in their bones that this was their last stand, that this, and indeed it was.
So what did they do then? Was it did they resort to praying to gods, or did they? Well,
they would have. They would have. We don't know exactly, but there's actually one. There is a text. It's interesting. The Ugaritic literature Ugaritic religious literature. There's lots of economic texts and stuff, but the Ugaritic religious literature that we have possessed today basically falls in two categories. One, the epics and myths, which is most of what I work on. The stories of Baal and his friends and enemies, and and human stories about human characters as well, in poetry. And ritual prescriptions, offer so and so many sheep to god so and so. We have lots of that, long lists of sacrifices to be carried out. What we don't have a lot of from Ugarit is hymns and psalms. We have lots of that in the Hebrew Bible. We have an entire book of them in the Hebrew Bible. Not as much in Ugarit. We have quite a bit from Mesopotamia as well. Hymns to Ishtar and hymns to Marduk. We don't have a lot of that from Ugarit. But among the few actual hymns and prayers that we do have from Ugarit, that's not just sacrifices, is a prayer or a spell, if you want to put it like that, directed to Baal, which says, recite this when you want to get Baal's protection against an attacker who attacks your walls, your city walls. And we don't know for a fact, but it's not too far-fetched to guess that this might have been a text they could have used when the Sea Peoples were coming.
So do we just have those one or two letters and that one or two psalm-like texts? Or how much is there talking about the downfall?
I mean, that's mostly the letters. Actually, and then there's the archaeology. You can see. See abandonment. You can see the climactic stuff, and but we don't have in terms of eyewitness accounts. It's mostly those letters, which are interesting enough, I can tell you, and I mean that must have been especially hard because Ugarit, it was one city and its surrounding countryside that was this micro kingdom. That was, it was in vassaldom to the greater powers of the age. But, they had their king, etc. And it was apparent, I actually put it in one text I'm about to publish a review, actually. I put it as like this, that Ugarit was a small kingdom with a big ego. They wanted to be one of the big guys, but they really weren't. And they were vassals to the Hittites and so on. But they invented their own script, for crying out loud, to show that there's show national pride. Probably there's a scholar called Philip Boyes has just written a book about this. Why the Ugaritic script appeared. Why, and he makes this point that they somehow made a nativist statement. That look at us, and given that they apparently did have this rather high view of themselves, small kingdom, big ego. It must have been especially hard to see that, we're out of troops.
Mm.
They're coming, and we're out of troops. That can't have felt very good, can it? Nope.
Mm. Well, the reason why I was curious whether there was more in the way of text is because I'm wondering if there's any. Probably there's not. It's probably a bit too much of a stretch to ask. But are there any lessons that we can take away for our own civilization?
Oh dear. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are. In the sense that destruction can come very suddenly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the that's a lesson from the whole Bronze Age collapse. Actually, that you had this golden age around the Eastern Mediterranean and all, across Mesopotamia. A golden age of high culture, of scholarship, of trade. It was the thing. And then it could all just within the scope of 100 years, less than that in some cases, you could just the whole thing just imploded on itself. And that's, I mean, it's very easy to think that you live in eternity, isn't it? That your civilization will persist forever. It's very easy to imagine that, and you can see that today. I mean, it's like, I mean, yes, people get afraid that COVID will destroy all of modern civilization, but do they really believe that? Do they really believe that? I don't know. Maybe some do, but still, the fact remains that even very, very complex cultures can collapse very, very quickly. When the snowball starts rolling, rolling down the hill, it can take very, very little time for things to get really, really ugly, and that, of course, is a lesson learned, and another one, like, I mean, you can see that in the Hebrew Bible as well, like in the book of Isaiah, where they try to maneuver between all these large powers. When Assyria started to expand westward, I mean, what we're going to do? Are we going to ally ourselves with them and call them in as a sort of, superpower? Let's not. Sort of superpower or other, or are we going to just keep to ourselves, or are we going to ally with the rebels who want to attack the superpower? And it's a very, very thin line to walk. And these aren't modern problems. These were problems for kings in ancient Israel. They were problems for the kings of Ugarit. They were problems for I mean, people who haven't read that much of the Hebrew Bible might be surprised how much of the prophetic writings are about politics. There's a lot about the politics of the day. Like Isaiah is full of this. Should we rebel against Assyria? Should we ally ourselves with Assyria? Or should we, just try to breathe calmly and hope that these, temporal struggles pass and that God protects Jerusalem, which was sort of seems to have been Isaiah's line, that, don't ally yourself with either the rebels, neither with the rebels nor with the Assyrians. Just trust that God will save Jerusalem. So that sort of thing that doesn't seem perhaps not very spiritual in the modern sense of the word, is very much at the forefront of what, say, the book of Isaiah is all about, or parts of the book of Isaiah.
So we shouldn't take the good times for granted.
No, we most certainly should not. And again, the world wasn't created in 1945.
Yeah, I guess to add to that, it's like right now is not special apart from the fact that we're here.
Yeah, exactly that. And also, the inverse of that, on the other hand, is that if major societal upheavals occur, that doesn't mean history stops. I mean, that's another, sort of fallacy that's quite easy to fall into, saying that, if our civilization doesn't survive exactly as it is now, then, the world is done for. Well, no, I mean, the Bronze Age civilizations of the ancient Near East many of them did collapse. But on the other hand, then during the Iron Age, we got new ones. That's when the Israelites start making a name for themselves, for example, because, then partly, I guess, because of the power vacuum. And that's where, Assyria started to become, first Assyria, then Babylonia became world powers. And they didn't care that they'd been a major collapse around 1200. That didn't deter them.
People often talk about the Library of Alexandria.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah. It being destroyed, I guess, like Ugarit. How important is that? Like, because people make it seem as though if it never was destroyed, we'd now be on Mars and the technology
No. I'd say that's hugely overblown. I mean, of course, it would have been nice if it weren't, but that goes for every ancient archive or library. That's nothing special for Alexandria. The Alexandria thing is more like it looks good on a t-shirt. I mean, would I have liked to see stuff from the Library of Alexandria? Obviously. Does that mean that the Library of Alexandria was the one thing defining all of ancient learning? No, it absolutely does not mean that.
No, sorry, go on.
I mean, we do have the Library of Nineveh, Ashurbanipal's Library of Nineveh, and that's a good thing. I mean,
it's comparable.
Win a few, lose a few. That's the way history works, unfortunately.
Did those libraries sort of overlap as well in terms of what they
No,
held?
They didn't. No, they wouldn't have. For purely linguistic reasons, the texts in Ashurbanipal's library were in Akkadian, which the scribes of Alexandria wouldn't have known. So, yeah.
So now that we've sort of sufficiently bathed ourselves in a conversation about Ugarit and ancient languages, and so the real question is, how did you get involved in nuclear semiotics? Was it your idea, or where did this come from?
No. I came into nuclear semiotics the pretzel way, so to speak. No, what happened was I published a number of books in Sweden.
I should just say nuclear semiotics, because we haven't defined that yet. So if anyone's confused,
haven't.
So maybe if you define that as well, just quickly with your answer.
Nuclear semiotics is not really my field. It was one I was pulled into for a bit, and it's the field that discusses how we are to communicate into the future about the storage of used nuclear fuel. That's basically what it is. How are we to communicate into eternity, basically, or at least for thousands and thousands of years, that yes, we have nuclear materials that are dangerous, and keep away, basically, and don't go here. Don't push this button, as I put it in an article of mine. That's basically nuclear semiotics. How are we supposed, in writing, in tradition, with art, whatever the case may be, to communicate this into the far reaches of the future? That's nuclear semiotics. And how I got into it, what happened was I've done quite a number of books, popular books. I've done scholarly books as well, but this was mostly due to my popular books in Sweden on ancient linguistics, on the Hebrew Bible, on Ugarit, on this sort of thing, these sorts of things, and which has now and then led to quite a bit of media exposure. And after one such thing, it was after I'd received a prize, and there was a newspaper article written in one of the major newspapers about yours truly, and discussing my work. And I got a phone call, one of the most surprising phone calls I've ever received. I may have been on a bus, if memory serves. Let's say it was on a bus. That serves the story. It may have been on a bus, and it says, "Hello, this is is this Ola Wikander, the guy doing ancient languages?" Well, yes, I can't say no. Well, this is the Swedish nuclear waste management company calling, and I was like, what? And it was, and it was a very nice guy from the Swedish Nuclear Waste Management Company, which is, as the name implies, the company that has the task given by the Swedish state to sort of manage the nuclear waste disposal thing in Sweden, and it's funded by the nuclear industry. They're obliged to fund this. It is a private company, but the funding is sort of directed towards them by the state. It's a very sort of convoluted thing. And they said, well, we read about you. Oh, nice. That's nice. And the thing was that they, as turned out to be the case, I didn't know this before, but many of their equivalent agencies around the world, because basically every nuclear nation has this sort of an agency or a company doing this sort of thing, and they've been working on these nuclear semiotic questions for years now, and some of them have used the expertise of people like me to put that question in perspective, and they wanted to do that. They said, we have a research budget that we would like to spend on this, partly on this sort of question, the question of linguistic transmissibility, the question of how languages change, the question of writing, the question of long-term preservation of texts, etc. Would you be interested in doing a minor research project for us on this? And this was at a point where I was just about, I think this was actually before I got my doctorate when they first contacted me. If again, my memory is a little fuzzy here, but I think it was before I got my doctorate. So this was more than 10 years ago. And if there's one thing that's on the mind of someone who's just about to get the doctorate, it's how am I going to get funding after my doctorate? That is the big question on the mind of every newly minted or about to be minted doctor of philosophy. So I was like, yeah, nice. Well, I had my, I wanted to know, what is this? Because I wanted to know, what my sort of scholarly freedom would be, etc. I didn't want to be ruled by the man, as it were. So, but they said, no, come up to Stockholm and we'll talk about it. And I did. I traveled up to Stockholm, and they made a very, very nice presentation about sort of what they wanted, and made it very clear that no, I was my own man. They would fund it, but I was my own man. They wouldn't rewrite my conclusions in any way, or even vet them. Actually, they wanted me to be a free agent, but funded by them. And the task was not specifically to come up with solutions to how to talk to future generations. It was like, we want you to speculate on what this question might entail from your perspective, and even more interestingly, in a way, what light it might shed on your field. And that's even cooler, and I tried to do that. I wrote 2 scholarly articles which were published in 2015. They're both freely available online, so you can read them.
They're quite readable, by the way. I went through them. They're quite readable
thanks,
for anyone.
thanks,
I'll link them down in the description.
Yeah, thank you, thanks a lot. And they are, one of them is focused on the question of religious preservation of text. How do religious elites preserve text for long times? And texts like the Bible or the Quran or the Vedic writings or whatever, because there actually was a suggestion made back already in the 80s. I think it was in 84, by a semiotician called Thomas Shebeck. He spelled Sebiok, but it's pronounced Shebeck, who had this idea that the solution would be to institute what he called a nuclear priesthood, which would be a sort of self-perpetuating oligarchy, which would know the truth about this, but they wouldn't tell it. They would keep it semi-secret and just tell the bare bones, to the hoi polloi, as it were. But they were supposed to sort of be tradents of this secret knowledge about the nuclear waste sites, and that's one of the problems I discussed. That yes, you could probably institute such a nuclear priesthood. That would probably be possible. But the problem would be that what we know of this sort of intelligentsia group, like Brahmins and rabbis and what have you, they're often extremely good at preserving text. They can often preserve text like verbatim over thousands of years with ingenious mnemotechnical error correcting methods, so that the text is very well preserved. But then they completely reinterpret its meaning, because the important thing is the letter of the text. And then you can write commentaries completely reinterpreting what the text means. Like a good example of this that I use in one of the articles, Isaiah chapter 40 talks about making the road straight through the desert for our God. That wasn't a literal quote, but basically that, which in context refers to the return of the Israelite refugees from Babylon. The exiled refugees that, they're to walk literally through the desert of what is today Jordan to get back to ancient Israel. It's very literal. That was later on reinterpreted as a prophecy about John the Baptist. A voice calls in the desert, make the road straight for our God, and interpreted as in the New Testament as a prophecy about John the Baptist who lived in the desert. And that's a very, very radical reinterpretation.
Can I ask you about this? Because I'm just curious. Separate to the how, because Christians do often talk about prophecy in the Old Testament. Prophecy about John the Baptist and Jesus and this sort of thing. And
yes.
How often does what modern day Christians hold up to scrutiny on the academic stage? Because the reason I asked this is because I was personally curious. I read about a prophecy and I went and looked in the Old Testament just out of curiosity, and I didn't see, I was not able, I know this is in English, I wasn't able to read the prophecy that people were saying was there. And it wasn't obvious to me. I can't, it's years ago now, I can't remember.
Yeah.
So how well do these prophecies hold up?
To answer that question in a polite yet correct way, one has to think of textual use in ancient Second Temple Judaism, which is the culture out of which Christianity subsequently grew. And that was a culture in which, and you find this not only in Christian text, you find it in Jewish text of that age as well. And it was a hermeneutical principle in which basically any text could illustrate any other text.
Mm-hmm.
You find that at Qumran, for example. Qumran is the place where the famous Dead Sea Scrolls were found, Khirbet Qumran, where there was a Jewish sect living. And they were the ones who preserved, the famous scrolls. But they had the scrolls that we normally speak of in terms of the Dead Sea Scrolls are the ones that are texts that later ended up in the Bible. But they had lots of other writings as well. They had lots and lots of texts, and many of those show us how they did hermeneutics, how they thought of their inherited text. And they did just that. Any good or any old text could be seen as a prophecy of any other text. They could take a text from a psalm and say that, this tells us about the Romans, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That was it was the done thing. That was the way texts were read. This isn't something specific to Christianity. Christianity took it in its own direction because it was specifically Jesus of Nazareth that was one found in the older text. But, they weren't the only ones to do this. It was a way of creative reinterpretation of earlier texts that was very much en vogue in the culture from which Christianity grew. So it wasn't a specifically Christian thing. Let's take a very famous example, the so-called Emmanuel prophecy in Isaiah, which talks about this ideal king that is to be born called Immanuel, which means God with us, Immanuel, and that's Emmanuel in English. When this text was written, this would probably have been a sort of a royalist sentiment that we will get a very, very good heir for the throne. One good bet is that it's meant to imply the king Hezekiah, or Hezkiyahu as he's called in Hebrew, Hezekiah, who was to be some sort of very good Davidic king in Jerusalem. Centuries later, the emerging Jesus movement, which later became what we know as Christianity, said, "Oh no, it's Jesus."
Mm-hmm.
Is this does that mean that this is a prophecy? Well, that depends on the reader, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And that goes for all of this stuff. What the New Testament writers want to do, especially some of the gospel writers, want to anchor their message about Jesus of Nazareth in texts that their readership would be familiar with, i.e., the texts we know as the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. They wanted, this happened so that XXX could be fulfilled. That means we didn't pull this out of thin air. It fits together. It's a way to build a coherent worldview, to say that you like these texts. Our new story fits with that.
Mm-hmm. So it wasn't even necessarily that the prophecy itself was... It's not just that the prophecy itself is maybe impressive, but that you gain these links that otherwise don't exist textually.
Yeah. I mean, if you ask a Jewish reader today about the Emmanuel prophecy, they would never say that it's about Jesus. They would never say absolutely not. That was a specific reading in the early Jesus movement, that yes, this is text about Jesus. And the same thing goes for one of the most famous ones, is the so-called songs of the suffering servant, also in the book, the later parts of the book of Isaiah, especially Isaiah chapters 52 and 53, which talk about a character, an unnamed character called the servant of God, servant of the Lord, who is subjected to all these sufferings. He suffered for our sakes, etc., etc., which in the traditional Jewish reading, and quite probably in a historically correct reading, is a reference either to the Jewish people or a subset of the Jewish people. But this text was taken up by the early Jesus movement, saying, no, it's Jesus. He's the one who's suffering for all of us. It's Jesus. But it's a creative reinterpretation of text. And the same goes for the John the Baptist passage, that we have a passage which was about go west, literally, going west through the desert from Babylon to ancient Israel. A voice shouts, make the path straight for our God through the desert. And then that was reread as, there's a voice shouting in the desert, make the and that voice is John the Baptist. But that's a very, very so I mean, prophecy is when we as scholars of the Hebrew Bible talk about prophecy, we just mean a certain category of texts that are prophetic in form, and that's texts like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Hosea. We don't mean prophecy in the sense of predicting the future. That's not what prophecy means in the scholarly sense. It just means a category of text. So, I mean, is Isaiah chapter 7, for example, a prophecy? Well, of course it's a prophecy in the sense that it's in a prophetical book, and it has is it a prophecy of Jesus of Nazareth? Well, that's a theological statement that's totally outside the purview of what we do. I mean, saying that is a prophecy about Jesus known as the Christ, is a Christian theological statement. It's not a scholarly statement.
I realize I've completely knocked you off where you were talking. So
no problem.
So we were talking about this atomic priesthood, and there's two things I want to say about this, which is first of all,
exactly, the term you used is atomic priesthood, not nuclear priesthood. Quite correct.
See, I've read your, but so there's 2 points I wanted to sort of. Just one is sort of just a statement, which is that, as soon as you're invoking an atomic priesthood to look after your waste management, then it becomes much more expensive to run a nuclear power station if you have to do that for the next 10,000 years. But that's just of to the side. But just because people might be lost with the idea of why this was put forward as an idea, there's sort of three problems you have to deal with. One is that you need the message to survive. Then the second is you need it to be translatable or understandable. And then you need people to actually follow the orders. Right? Because and that last one is perhaps the most difficult one. Because why should I guess I can put it to you, like, why should our descendants listen to us? In their mind, we're just some fossil fuel farmer, some backwater.
Yes. Indeed. And that's one of the main points I want to make, especially in one of these articles I referred to, is that we have to imagine a number of different scenarios. One of them is complete continuity. If we have complete continuity, then there isn't that much of a problem. Then it's just a matter of preservation and error correction, in the sense that we have to error correct for reinterpretation, which is a huge problem in and of itself. So, and then we have the linguistic problem, which is also huge. But if there isn't complete continuity, we have at least two possibilities, perhaps more. We have the possibility of a very quote unquote primitive society in the future who just doesn't understand what nuclear power is. How do we speak to such a society? And then we have the other problems, a hyper advanced society, which will say that, no, these guys didn't understand nuclear power. It was just superstition to them. It was like, so we don't have to care about their warnings because they didn't understand what was good for them. These unevolved, pathetic human beings of the early 21st century. Blah. And we have to, and that's it's a definite problem. And I use one example very clearly. Others have used similar, that from the ancient world, there are enormous amounts of, funerary inscriptions saying basically this: do not open this sarcophagus. There are no treasures in it. And if you do open it and desecrate it, all the gods will destroy you and your inheritance and your descendants, and you will be blotted out from the earth, and Baal and all his friends will crush you. So insert whatever god suits the context. And I actually start one of the articles by quoting at length one such text, a Phoenician inscription on the sarcophagus of a Phoenician king called Ishmun-Azor II, which threatens the reader with all these sorts of curses if the reader were to be so obnoxious as to disturb the resting place of the king, which doesn't help the fact that his resting place was moved to the Louvre and by archaeologists who didn't care one jot about the Phoenician gods because they didn't believe, well, there's the word believe again, but they didn't count with the Phoenician gods as dangers. And we could very well imagine a future in which they knew about nuclear power, but counted it as superstition or as something irrelevant or as something that only weak ancient peoples were susceptible to, or whatever, because it would be to them like the Phoenician gods are to some modern people today. That's a problem.
I wonder, it makes me kind of wonder if we're sort of dooming ourselves, because, if we want people to listen to us in the future, when we're long dead, we no longer have any sort of say how things run. And the fact that we very happily remove those pharaohs or whoever it is from their tombs and put them in museums and so on, we're not sort of setting a very good precedent. So I guess the question is, how should we balance the wishes of long dead kings with the fact that you could learn a lot of, interesting things from pulling apart their gravesites?
I mean, oh dear. That all depends on that depends on so many moral questions about, the integrity of the dead. And, it's a huge can of worms right there, which has in itself nothing to do with the nuclear problem, because it has to do with, respect for dead people, and for that matter, whether big Phoenician gods will come and strike you with a bolt of lightning. That's another problem, if you believe that. But I mean, the one thing that I will say, and I do say in the other article, in fact, is that this whole problem, in a very, very dramatic way, shows the necessity of preserving the discipline of philology and historical linguistics and textual study, because without these disciplines, future peoples will be completely unable to understand what the frack we're saying, and that's for many reasons. A, they won't have perhaps not have the archaeological acumen to dig it out, so we need archaeology as well. But also language will change. I have an example in one of the articles on how much, East Engle hävdon ätes geseald Alfred Kuninge. That's Old English. And that's like a little more than a millennium old, but it's still basically not understandable to a modern English speaker. You had to learn it as a foreign language, you know. Here on this year was Ethel something or other Jehalgiod to Bishop Stole. Most English speakers today wouldn't understand that, and it's the same language, just about a little more than a millennium later. So languages do change dramatically over time. Even languages spelt as conservatively as English, because English has a very, very conservative spelling, as we discussed earlier. But even then, the difference becomes vast over, say, a millennium or so. So we need to preserve historical linguistics, because historical linguistics is what gives us the opportunity and the ability to reconstruct what earlier language looked like. That's the only thing that gives us. And the other possible thing, of course, is just preserving language through tradition. And it's worked for Latin and it's worked for Hebrew. It didn't work for Ugaritic, for example. Didn't work for Akkadian. So sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. We have to preserve what I would refer to as philological exegesis. That is the philological study of ancient texts and the study of how they are, again, can be reinterpreted, because we have to error correct for these possible reinterpretations. People might think that nuclear power is a god, for example. People might think that, oh yeah, cool, they have nuclear fuel. We should dig that stuff up and use it.
One thing I'm curious about is, I had this interesting situation about 5 years ago. I spent some time growing up in Newcastle, Australia, and maybe 5 or so years ago, I returned to Newcastle just after there was a huge storm. And what had happened during the storm is some train tracks that used to exist were exposed. The sand sort of washed off them.
Ah, okay.
And no one, as far as I know, no one knew no one had any memory that these train tracks existed. And Australia is like 200 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is, like, very simply, how do things get why in a couple generations can we completely forget that a train line exists? It seems what's the mechanism there that makes us so forgetful?
Well, dear me, I'd say personally, the mechanism there is just lack. This must seem like something of a not an oxymoron. What's the word? It means just like me repeating what you're saying, but the mechanism is forgetfulness. Because but seriously, if something doesn't have tradence, if something doesn't have someone handing it over to the next generation, and it isn't sort of present either in archival form or in front of your eyes, it's gone. It's gone unless you physically dig it up. Like Ugarit. Before Ugarit was discovered, a couple of decades before, they actually didn't know that Ugarit had existed, because it is mentioned in Hittite letters, and the Hittite kingdom had just been discovered, which had also been, the Hittite Empire was absolutely forgotten. It was one of the major empires of the ancient world, and it was like gone. Nobody knew there had been a big Hittite empire. They knew the word Hittite, but that was it. And then the Hittite Empire was rediscovered and its language deciphered. It turned out to be an Indo-European language that is very distantly related to English. And I do believe I think it's in some Hittite letter, or possibly in an Elamana letter. That is a letter from what is preserved in what is today Egypt. But anyway, that did mention that Ugarit was a very affluent place, but nobody knew where it was until they physically dug the whole thing up at Ras Shamra in Syria. And that could happen to Lund, the city where I live. It could happen to London. It could happen to Newcastle. It could happen to anything. As soon as people aren't passing memory on, it's gone. And it just takes one generation for it to be. Unless it's written down in big block letters somewhere or physically preserved. It's gone. That's just the way things are.
So I guess I mean, you're really putting it in perspective. An entire civilization disappeared into nothingness, and yet we're expecting to be able to tell people that there's this one nuclear dump here, 10,000, and also we're looking at much smaller timescales here when we're talking about you know, if you want to look 10,000 years in the future, then it starts becoming much more problematic, in fact, doesn't it? What resolution do you suspect people will understand our current culture 10,000 years from now? Like, I'm guessing Elvis is gone.
I mean, how would I know? I mean, we don't even know what language will be spoken in major language. What will be the major language of the world? Major languages in 50 years. We can guess. We can venture a good guess. We can say that English will probably be a thing. Chinese will probably be a thing. Russian will probably be a major thing. But do we know for certain? No, we don't. And we're talking tens of thousands of years. Ouch. I mean, it's so hard. I mean, the story of the Hittite Empire, which was rediscovered and very extensively so, is they did one thing right. They wrote on non-perishable material. They wrote on clay. They probably didn't exclusively write on clay. They may have written on wooden boards as well, and those, of course, are not preserved, which is a hassle. But the clay stuff is preserved, which means that we have lots of Hittite text, lots and lots of it. And then texts in other languages which were in use in the Hittite Empire because it was a massively multilingual society. And they were smart, so they wrote on non-perishable material, as did the Ugaritians. They wrote on clay, and clay, it works well. Paper is bad because it is destroyed very easily. Papyrus is destroyed very easily. I mean, it's no coincidence that the places where we have huge preservation of papyri from the ancient world, from the Greco-Roman world, is Egypt, because the sands of the Nile sands and the extreme aridity preserves papyrus, in which most climates don't. And also from places like Herculaneum, which was one of the cities that were buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which preserves it. But we have those are places where you get lots of papyri because it's such a perishable material, and paper is very perishable. Digital stuff even more so. I mean, they used to say that CDs had an expected lifetime of 5 years. It turned out to be better than that because most of those can be read without any problem, and even old floppies from the 80s can mostly be read one problem. I grew up with a Mac Plus. Which said "bing" when you started. It's a wonderful piece of tech from the early 80s, or mid 80s. The problem there is that those discs, the floppies for the non-floppy floppies, most of them are preserved, but you can't find a floppy drive for them that can read them. So they're basically unreadable today if you don't have legacy hardware. And that's just within a couple of decades. Come on. Yep.
So if you had to, I know that when you wrote the articles, you were sort of fleshing out ideas of what could go wrong or what some of the, and so you didn't really, as far as I remember, you didn't really put forward full solutions. But if someone put the gun to your head and you had to, so I could put forward a suggestion. My suggestion, from what I'm just hearing from you, is that maybe you want to think about the location. You want to put it, if you're going to be writing things in on papyrus, maybe you want the region to be dry. But so if you had to put forward some suggestions, is the atomic priesthood realistic? Is there something better than that? Could we? Is there a better way of embedding in the culture? What would you, if you had to?
Yeah, I mean, I have had to on certain occasions because perhaps nobody's put a gun to my head, but they have put microphones to my head, or to my mouth rather. So I've had to answer this question as well as I can on certain occasions, and I'll try here as well. Well, I think the main word should be redundancy. Redundancy. Moreness. We need moreness, and we need moreness on every variable. That is, we need many different languages. We need many different styles and subsets of languages, like the Etruscan example. Then it may be the case that people in the future know English, but only parts of the English vocabulary. We need redundancy in terms of style and vocabulary and format. We need both warning signs and saying just keep away dangerous, and scholarly or scientific treatises. We need both of these sorts of things, and anything in between. We need many languages, many different styles, many materials. We need clay, we need wood, we need, well, perhaps not wood, we need cement, we need paper, maybe we even do need the atomic priesthood. Not in the sense, I don't think in the sense that Shebek argued. I'm not a great fan of this secretive stuff. This all, not telling people what this really was and hiding it like a sort of Illuminati thing. I'm not into that. But perhaps a group of people who learn stuff by heart. That's not the worst of ideas. It isn't. But the worst of ideas is doing that and just letting them go off and not doing any error correcting, because then they'll reinterpret this as being an epic story about gods battling it out for copper or whatever. So, so my main recipe, if I were to have a gun put to a nuclear gun, weird expression, put to my head, would be redundancy. Many modes of preservation, many languages, many styles. Many vocabularies, many kinds of material, as much as possible. And
it makes
spread the risk. Many places, above ground, below ground, on mountaintops, what have you. Just make sure that things will go wrong. Things will go wrong. So we need as much error correction as humanly possible.
It makes two questions sort of spring to mind. So I'll ask them in because they're sort of unrelated. But the first one is, do you think we're driving towards a world where there are going to be less languages, in the sense that, if you went to France maybe a couple of hundred years ago, maybe you would have seen the region that's modern day France, maybe you would have seen lots of little regions with Ossetian and all these different. Do you think we're driving to a world where, due to our interconnectedness, you won't have the possibility of having that redundancy in terms of languages?
Well, we are currently, as of right now, we are seeing a great reduction in the amount of languages, which is a very sad thing, and languages are dying out. How quickly they do is a debated question. There are, all these sort of figures that X amount of languages die out in X time, and but languages certainly are dying out, but they've been dying out for a long time. That's not a new thing. Ugaritic died out. Hittite died out. Sumerian died out. But lots of languages are dying out right now due to, as you say, sometimes it's due to very, very brutal reasons. War is one major war and economics. If you get, for example, a situation where you've been ruled by a power which is disinclined to use the language you've been brought up with, and you can only use that language at home. You can't use it in commerce. You can't use it when addressing the authorities. That language is set for, or at least it runs the risk of extinction. Not necessarily. Sometimes these problems, these tendencies can be counteracted. There are good examples of language revitalization where you consciously fight to keep a language alive.
Irish, I suppose.
Irish is one example.
And Hebrew itself, right? I guess Hebrew could
Yeah,
have...
well, Hebrew is a very specific example because it was revived in a modern form, which is in many ways rather different from its earlier periods. So that's a...
But it involved a priesthood in some sense, no?
Oh yes, it did. I mean, Hebrew had never died out in the sense that nobody used it. It never died out in that sense. It did die out in the sense that it was never anybody's first language. But it was used in liturgy. It was used for writing, etc. It's very different than, say, Sumerian, which died out completely in the sense that it was preserved as a scholarly language for almost 2,000 years, which is pretty cool. I mean, it's like Latin. In Sumerian, we don't know exactly when it died out as a native language, probably around the 2000 BCE mark, perhaps a little later than that. But then it was kept alive as a scholarly language for almost 2 millennia after that, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. It's like Latin's been used in the Western world, and like Hebrew was used in Judaism. So, spoken Hebrew died out around, again, we don't know exactly, but around 200 CE, give or take. And then it was strictly it was a learned language. Nobody spoke it as their first language. That doesn't mean it wasn't used. It was used for certain purposes. It was used in poetry. It was used in literature. It was used in liturgy. It was sometimes, rarely, but sometimes even spoken. But then when modern Zionism was born, it was chosen as the main language in the Jewish settlement in what was then... in Palestine and what later became the State of Israel, but that's a very, very specific development that basically hasn't happened anywhere else. But language revitalization has happened in many places, and Irish is one example. The Gaeltacht, which keeps it alive, and it's become almost it's parts of Ireland a bit hip to know Irish. It's cool. For some people, which is a great thing. I love that. But sure, languages are dying, but that doesn't mean redundancy. To get back to the main question, sorry for all these tangents I'm going off on.
It's perfect.
But, yeah. But the question of creating linguistic redundancy in nuclear semiotics, that is writing in many different languages, well, that won't be a problem, because we still have 6,000 or between 5,000 and 6,000 languages spoken, depending on how you count language and dialect and all that. We will not be having one single language anytime soon. Let's put it like that. I don't think that will ever happen, and I'm very, very happy it won't. Linguistic diversity is a treasure. It's a feature. It isn't a bug.
So I have to point out a possible problem with the redundancy idea, though. Because we translated I won't know the name of the scripts, but the ancient Egyptian scripts using the Rosetta Stone, right? And
starting with that, but then it was a long process after. But yes, starting there, yes.
What was the name of the script?
Well, the script everybody knows about from Egypt is hieroglyphic.
Okay.
But there were also the Demotic and hieratic scripts were quite as common as and possibly more common actually in practice. They had three scripts.
So I imagine a situation in the future where we've long forgotten all of our modern languages, all the 6,000 languages that we currently have, let's say. But we know one location where we can get a Rosetta Stone, and that is we go to the nuclear waste facilities, where we have this, this Rosetta Stone of redundancy built into the system. Yeah. And so the problem might be that actually your defense mechanism becomes the thing that attracts people to come into the facility in the first place.
Yeah, well, but that... The answer there is, of course, that the Rosetta Stone shouldn't only be in the facility. It should be somewhere else. or if it were to be in the facility, it would be at the absolute entrance, not down among the canisters, hopefully, because there it wouldn't do a fat lot of good, would it? No, I mean, the redundancy has to be spatial as well. You have to, you would have to have these texts and descriptions, and not only text. I mean, I've been focused on text, obviously, because I'm a text guy. It's what I do. But I know that there have been, lots of other scholars from other fields working in nuclear semiotics who have been, they've been discussing symbols and spikes and blue forests and genetically engineered blue forests and all these sorts of, all this kind of stuff, which is pretty cool. I don't know enough about it to make a solid judgment, but it sounds cool enough. But anyway, I mean, the redundancy has to be, like I said, on all the variables. It has to be redundancy of space. It has to be redundancy of language. It has to be redundancy of material. It has to be redundancy of vocabulary, of style, etc., 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 etc. So I don't think having too much information will be a big problem. No, the problems I see are rather stuff like, will people even care? Even if they can read it, will they even care? And that's that's not easy to control, is it? No. It's really, really hard.
So I want to finish the conversation on a question which directs more towards your personality again.
Oh yeah.
So just out of curiosity, you study history over large periods of time, and as I mentioned at the very beginning of the conversation, is there any perspective you gain for the value of the time we have on Earth now? Like, is there, do you live your life differently, but knowing that 10,000 years from now, whole civilizations would disappear, let alone your own works? Is there any perspective you can share on what does your study over thousands of years teach us about our lives today and your own life?
Yeah, lots of things. And does it affect me? Yes, constantly. I mean, just to add one thing that, I got into this, basically, for me, it was very much a family matter. I grew up in a classicist household. Both my parents was, my mother is deceased, classicist and classical archaeologists, and that meant that the study of the ancient world was sort of ingrained in the whole sort of family project, as it were. But I went on in my own direction, but that meant that I grew up with this sort of question surrounding me constantly, and my work in ancient texts have sort of underpinned that even more, helped underpin that. And yeah, I mean, it's many different things that you learn to put your life in perspective. One of them, of course, is we're just a grain of sand, and etc., on a huge beach of time, if that makes any bad analogy, but you get my point. And that can be a bit scary, obviously. I mean, the ancient Proto-Indo-Europeans, the linguistic ancestors of English and Swedish and most of the languages in Europe and northern India, historical linguists have reconstructed quite well what their language would have sounded like, give or take 6,000 years ago, when they started moving across what is today Europe, or towards, at least, and using sound laws, etc. That's been a very successful endeavor. And one of the terms that they apparently used was, we know this term because it appears both in Greek, it's descendants. It's one of these inherited motifs. It occurs verbatim, both in Greek in that case and in Vedic Sanskrit. In Greek, it's kleos aptiton, and in Sanskrit, it is shravas akshitam, or akshitam shravas, actually, which means imperishable fame. It's the exact same phrase, imperishable fame. In Proto-Indo-European, it would have been ndguitom klewos, which was apparently a term for the eternal fame of heroes, that they will sing lays about you forever, that perhaps you can't be immortal, but you will have you will have eternal, imperishable fame. The problem is that studying texts and ancient cultures in the way that this type of scholarship does is that what you learn is that maybe you won't. It's a weird double effect that on one hand you can reconstruct the term the Proto-Europeans had for imperishable fame. On the other hand, you know that the fame will probably never be imperishable. But on the other hand, it held on for 6,000 years. That's not too bad, is it? I mean, or 5,500, whatever. It's not too bad. Like, or even 6,000 years ago, there were Indo-European bards, Proto-Indo-European bards, probably in southern Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, somewhere, dreaming about their imperishable fame. And here we are today, 6,000 years later, reconstructing the very words they used to say it. Isn't that pretty cool? And trying to reconstruct their myths as well. And we're doing the same for ancient Semitic. And I mean, that is pretty cool. So on one hand, you get this fear that, oh yeah, the sun will go out and the solar system will be destroyed and the heat death of the universe and blah, you can get pretty despondent about the whole thing. On the other hand, well, 6,000 years isn't that bad, is it? 6,000 years isn't that bad, is it? I mean, so it's both the feeling of this enormous feeling of continuity and of survival and of dread at the same time. And both are true, both are true. And you get this, and another thing it gives us is, or at least me, is, again, we weren't born in a vacuum. We weren't born in 1991 or 1981, as in my case, or 1945, or whatever cutoff date we want to see as extremely important for our civilization. Everything is built on what came before, the thoughts of the people who came before. Even if they did believe in Leviathans, some people do believe in Leviathans to this day, and it influences them to this day. Some people do worship Odin to this day. Well, perhaps it wasn't an unbroken continuity, but some people have started worshipping Odin again. Are the gods dead? ? Maybe they aren't. And all this. I mean, it shows that we're not just living in this tiny, pointless vacuum. We're living in a long historical narrative almost that we can actually start to see the outlines of. It doesn't have a goal. I personally don't believe that it has a goal. Some would. I mean, that's one of the major ideas of Christianity, for example, and so that history does have a goal. That sometime at one point Jesus will come back and the world's going to end. That's not my perspective, but even if the world doesn't have a goal, it has a history. It has a history of which we are parts, and every word we utter, every thought we think has been engendered in this massive linguistic, cultural, what have you. And that's pretty cool to see. I mean, we can never reconstruct all of it, but we can see bits and pieces, and that's pretty cool.
Ola, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Likewise.
Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.